meeting like this, there should be an icebreaker, and the icebreaker should be provided by the fellow or the person that's standing out front trying to get the order. So I'm going to try to give you my favorite icebreaker. It so happened that this couple in their late 50s, come on, there's plenty of room over here. If you come last, you got to sit up. The last one in is the first one out.
Thank you.
Where's Merle? Put up your hand, Merle. Merle Chamberlain? There you are. There goes the bell. Can I start? Anyhow, this couple in their late 50s, that's 20 years ago for me, we're sitting around having a little cup of tea before dinner one evening, and we started talking about this and that, and the husband said to the wife, darling, if I die, do you plan to remarry? So she thought a moment, looked at him, smiled a little bit. She said, oh, he said, if you remarry, will you live in this house with him? She thought a minute, let it drag on. She said, well, yeah. Well, if you remarry, will he drive my automobile? Well, if you remarry, will he sleep in my bed? She said, absolutely. And he said, well, will he use my golf clubs? She said, no, he's left-handed. So I broke the ice. Yeah, I love those golf jokes. Anyhow, this afternoon we want to follow this program of ours to the letter, so we'll get underway. First, a few business items that I hope will be of interest to you all, because I know they've been a great interest to your staff and your officers. Number one, these are figures that as of the end of the month, as of the end of April. We're hanging in there with our number one asset, which, of course, our members, we have about 800. With respect to dollars, and that's always important, we have a bank balance of about $800. In our securities fund, we have about $57,000. In our Latimer House fund, we have a $9,000. And in the Lewis T. Moore fund, we have $3,400. That's in terms of our current assets. Our fixed assets, of course, we have our wonderful Latimer House and servants' quarters. In the Latimer House, we have 9 full rooms of Victorian period furnishings. We have our garden, and of course, last but not least, our archives. Now, with respect to our liabilities, 0. We are able to pay all invoices on a monthly basis. Now, next year's fiscal year budget, the budget for next fiscal year, which starts at the start of the 1st of May, first of this month, $72,000, and we have every indication to do it. And for this purpose, I'll call on our committee chairman, Beverly Tibbs. Beverly?
Our committee chose for a recipient of the Clarendon Award, Chris Eugene Fonvielle, who is a native of Wilmington. We're giving it to him for his master's thesis, To Forge a Thunderbolt, the Wilmington Campaign, February 1865. Chris grew up, as I said, in Wilmington. He grew up on Minerva Circle. He He attended local schools. He graduated from UNCW, and after that served as curator of the Blockade Runner Museum in Carolina Beach. When the Blockade Runner Museum sold its assets to our county museum, Chris worked with the county museum and integrated the two collections. Then he left Wilmington. He went to graduate school at East Carolina University, where he received his master's degree in history, and he's just about to finish up his doctoral degree at the University of South Carolina, also in history. This, To Forge a Thunderbolt, is our first real detailed account of the Wilmington Campaign. I've been the local history librarian at the public library for 9 years, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, what happened in Pine Valley? Was there a skirmish there? Where was it? Who was involved? What happened at Sugarloaf? Why did the Yankees come up the Brunswick County side of the river when they were attacking Wilmington? Who attacked Wilmington? How many Federals were there? Who was in Wilmington when it was occupied? All of these questions are answered in this wonderful, well-researched, scholarly thesis by Chris. And so with great pleasure, I ask Chris to come forward and receive the Clarendon Award. His name is
Wilmington was captured in February 1865, and there were a number of Confederate prisoners captured during the campaign. One of whom was this old rebel on the streets of Wilmington waiting to be paroled. This young Yankee lieutenant approached him to break the ice and start a conversation. He looked awfully smart in his new blue uniform and his brass buttons, and obviously had just come down from Washington. This rebel kept with him a little bit, and the lieutenant said, "Rebel, how far do you think it is from Fort Fisher to Wilmington?" The old rebel thought for a moment. He said, "Well, I reckon it's about 3,000 miles." He may have been wearing a blue uniform, but he wasn't that young. He says, 3,000 miles? I thought it was more like 15 or 20 miles. The old rebel thought for a moment. He said, "No, it's more like 3,000 miles. It took you damn Yankees 4 years to take the town. It's more like 3,000. I didn't know that the two words were synonymous, or two separate words until I was about 20 years old. I knew my grandparents did. Well, Beverly asked me to talk a little bit about how I became interested in local history, which started me in an area that I had given a lot of thought to before, not in some time, but it's not going to be too hard to convince many of you here today that those of you who are very interested in history and the historical society, history is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Some of us are absolutely obsessed with history. I contend that we're all searchers, and it's important that we study the past to gain a better understanding of who we are. I'm not cavalier enough to think that perhaps that by knowing more about the past, we can greatly influence the future. In fact, one thing that I think history teaches us is, in fact, that humans learn very little from their history. But nevertheless, I think it gives us a window to who we are, to gain a better understanding of who we are. We're all searchers, and I think that helps us in our quest for great knowledge. But at a very young age, a number of people and institutions impressed me. They touched my interest, nurtured the interest that I had in local history, and it allowed me ultimately to pursue a profession. My family impressed me very, very deeply with their great stories about the farm explored my environment and the neighborhood. There were a number of people in the neighborhood who had a great impression on me. The Greens, my best friends across the street, Mr. Green frequently taught me about American history. His oldest son, Charles, used to often coach me in the history of what I call the Civil War. I didn't understand the definition of Civil War. To me, it was the Silver War. I didn't understand why armies would go to war over silver. All of that understanding came later. And of course, it didn't hurt that Dr. Bob Fales was from Renova Circle. In fact, half the congregation here today, I think, is from Renova Circle. Good to be among family and friends again. I attended St. James Church, which, of course, had a great tradition of local history. When I was a young boy, Fanny Garzette was still living. In fact, at age 96, she was still singing in the church choir. She had a tremendous influence on me. Allie Beck, I grew up beside in Renova Circle, was a member of that congregation, as was Miss Peggy Perdue. To me, in those days, it was Miss Peggy Moore, whose father was Louis T. Moore. Miss Peggy was here today, taught me there's a red bird and a blue bird in kindergarten when I was about 5 years old. Jane Reddick, Billy McCaffrey, and the descendants of Dr. James Blunt all attended St. James Church, and all of us had a tremendous influence on me. As I became more aware of our community's history, I started to take a greater interest in it and started to become more familiar with the historiography. So I started to read the historical literature that was available to me, to all of us today. Dr. James Spunch writing the course, George Davis, Mr. Henry McCoy, Lewis Moore, of course, Billy McCaffrey, Debbie Reeves, Ida Kellerman, and then more recently, of course, writings of Diane Cashman, Bob Fales, Bill Reeves, Alan Watson, and many, many others. One of the greatest moments, I think, in writing my life was an interview that I had with Betty Dick, the mother of Louis Walkman, when I went down Maryland Road. At the time, Ms. Dick was 101 years old, this was by 1977, but had known most of these people that I mentioned. She knew Dr. James Crump. She knew Mr. George Davis. For me to speak to someone who actually lived a part of, or shared a part of their lives, quite an inspiration. Well, there was this overriding interest in the Civil War that Charles Green first tapped. And as a young boy, I visited the many defenses and fortifications in the area, Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, and so forth. And of course, I heard from many Wilmingtonians the great stories of the Confederate defenders of Wilmington. Venerable General Whiting, who died shortly after the fall of Fort Fisher, Colonel Lamb. And so all of this had a great impression on me, and then when I became the curator of the Blockade Runner Museum, I started to pursue it even more so. One other man that I would like to mention who was of a great influence to me was Dr. Tom Mosley. When I started UNCW, I was very interested in history, but was unsure how far I could go with it. But Tom Mosley nurtured me, encouraged me, prodded me, yes, kicked me when I needed it, but convinced me that I had the ability to pursue this profession, that I had the ability to be a scholar, and finally sunk in. And to him, of course, I owe a great deal of gratitude. When I left Wilmington, I went to East Carolina and had all intentions of pursuing my degree in working on my master's thesis in local history, because I thought that it had been greatly overlooked in Civil War historiography. Wilmington was a very, very important port during the Civil War, as you all know. It was a haven for blockade runners that made frequent trips into southern ports to supply the Confederacy with goods and provisions that they needed to sustain their war effort. With the eventual close of most of the southern seaports, Wilmington took on an increasing importance, so that by the summer of 1864, it was the last seaport effectively open to commercial trade with the outside world. Fort Fisher was the main guardian, the main protector of that important port. Fort Fisher was the largest and strongest Confederate seacoast fortification. It was And the Union operations to capture that fort very late in the war were the largest combined operations in the history of the Civil War. In fact, the largest combined operations until D-Day, 1944. The Wilmington Campaign, that is the subsequent Union attempts to capture the town after they captured Fort Fisher, which of course was very important, was the first successful movement by a large Union army against a strategic interior target from a captured seacoast base. Now that had been a very important part of naval operations at the beginning of the war, that is to capture important seacoast bases and then strike against interior targets inside the South that were very important to the Confederacy. But not until the Wilmington Campaign in 1865 did the Navy and Army implement that strategy that was proposed back in 1861. But yet all of this has been overlooked until more historiography. That's why to forge a thunderball both came about. And at least in the last chapter, I do look at the occupation of the town. So I wanted to see under what circumstances the town was captured and how the residents of the town adjusted to the federal occupation, the transition from being Confederate to being Union again. That all was very interesting. And in lieu of the time, I would be glad to discuss that in greater detail with y'all elaborate. But all of these things, I think, greatly impressed me enough to do this thesis. And I will continue. I'm expanding the thesis to include a more detailed examination of the Fort Fisher battles, which, as you know, is undergoing another battle at this time. And fortunately, we have Dr. Robert Bales who's heading that effort trying to sort of forward. But I'm greatly honored to receive this award. I thank my family, my friends for coming. Many of my family members came from a long way to be with me today to share this with me. I thank those of you who I know very well, who know the circle for coming. It means an awful lot to me. And most of all, I thank my wife Nancy, whose name should be on this book, because without her reference, I would not have done. Thank you very much.
The members of the committee decided to give a society cup this year.
That's my personal opinion. I know he's got a big future ahead of him. I've read this. Stand and read the book, touch him. Gave me the opportunity to glance at it this morning. Chris has a big future ahead of him. I think everybody ought to give him a hand.